Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner. As part of our Mind-Body Connection series, today I'm going to help you know how to search for, access, and create your core narrative, as it is so important in finding your power, crushing that doubt, and dealing with your emotional themes most effectively and efficiently. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and I'll get back to you personally. I have a feeling I know what most of you are thinking at the beginning of this video. Just what is a core narrative? But of course, if you've been following me for a little bit, you may actually know. Now, this is something I developed myself, but it also relates to things I've heard in psychology before. I'm just applying it with a mind-body perspective in a different way, and I found it to be incredibly useful myself, and that's why I'm passing it on to you. So what is a core narrative as I define it? For one thing, it hits your most central theme in life. So we have lots of different emotional themes. If you've been following me enough to know that there's the emotions column that I talk about, those are many different themes. Usually it's anywhere from 6 to 15 even, themes of your life. But if you're looking for a core narrative, you want the one that captures the absolute central part of your story. And I'm going to help you figure out how to do that. Here's one thing it's not, though. Your core narrative recognizes that past negative interpretations about you are not true and rejects them. So we may have a central narrative that is negative. That is not your core narrative. Your core narrative is going to be something that's very positive about your central theme of life, what it means about you in a good way, and what you can do about it. So another way of thinking about it is that it's a positive and powerful take on what your trauma has done to make you who you are at your core. Now, some people don't like the word trauma, and that's okay. You can substitute a different word for it. Some people like to talk about little t trauma as opposed to capital T trauma. I don't care what you call it. I just want you to recognize that you had a real experience that mattered and was formative in making you who you are. You don't have to call it trauma, but it's the central part of what happened, your story, that makes you you. On top of having it be a major theme and something related to your core narrative and your core story, it also has a major action step attached to it to help you remember who you are and what you're going to do about it. So I don't want you to just develop a core narrative. I want to talk about what do we do with it. I actually consider that to be a part of the core narrative. And the last thing about what a core narrative is that it's something that's going to bring you a sense of real peace about that central issue that you haven't gotten to before. So I'm sure it sounds like a tall order, and in a way it is, but the great thing about mind-body work is it works different than therapy, and that's a good thing because so many of us, myself included, have experienced years and years of therapy. In my case, it was a couple decades of therapy, and that therapy was very useful in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's not, but it didn't get me to peace about my core narrative. It didn't even totally organize my core narrative, and maybe it should have. I'll revisit that later in a video on what therapy should be from my perspective. But after all of my years of therapy, I really didn't know my core narrative. I didn't even know really that concept, and it's a concept that I developed as I got better. So the thing that taught me about the core narrative was my body. The body is what teaches you your core narrative. This is why it's so important to follow symptoms and understand that they are not just a distraction. They're also a communication. They are telling you who you are. If you follow the body and you interpret what's happening, the symptoms are communicating to you what you need to know. I'm not saying it's easy to figure out all the time, but especially if you have a lens to look through to understand this, like my videos or my upcoming book or the PDFs that I have available for purchase. These are things that can help you understand the language of the symptoms. The core narrative, though, is a major part of what is being communicated, and this is why I developed the power column, because the emotions column helps us understand the onset and uptick of symptoms. The doubt column helps us understand the chronicity of symptoms and how to break that chronicity. But it's the power column that tells us about your core narrative. The core narrative is within the power column. So here is how we do it. The job starts with understanding what is being communicated by the body, and this is done with the 3 columns. The first thing you do in trying to develop a core narrative is you go through your theme list in the emotions column, and you need to decide what you would say about them that captures all of your core narrative theme. What do these themes have in common? So the emotional theme list is incredibly important for the onset and uptick of symptoms and understanding that. But taken together, we're looking for an exceedingly broad idea that covers all of these different themes. But it also should eventually be tied to your main specific trauma. So here are some examples of that general broad picture when you're looking for your core narrative. These are just ideas. I'm not saying they will apply to you, but some of them will, and they'll give you the concept, that incredibly broad feel. Validity is one. Danger, betrayal, not being heard, seen, or believed, not being respected, not having any worth. Betraying the self is another one. Having your reality questioned. These are such big ideas. And in general, you're going to see a lot of your emotional themes relate to all of these things. So you're going to see which one of those, and maybe some others, and we can talk about it in the comments. What are some other ideas that fit with this? You can develop that. But I want you to get a sense of the kind of things. And these are high-stakes things, and they're very broad, and they don't describe something specific. Betrayal is a very general concept. It's one that many of us can relate to. Then we start to get the specific. So here are some examples of specific things that might get tied in your core narrative. And by the way, I'm going to tell you what mine is, although I've mentioned it in other videos. I'm going to tell you so that you can see how I got it from this. Or actually, that's not true. I developed this from my core narrative, but you can get it from this. I'm giving you a framework. So the specific kind of thing that gets attached to that general broad picture are things like a specific event or longer time period of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. And don't forget, they're all emotional abuse. Every single type of abuse is also emotional abuse. That's the one that often gets left out. Sometimes it's just emotional abuse. And that's, believe me, bad enough. A death in the family, especially of a traumatic nature, an illness dominating a family, favoritism, some kind of traumatic event that you were either part of or you witnessed, the denial of a traumatic event. I'm going to underline that one because a lot of times there's trauma and then there's the trauma that follows from the trauma. And many studies show that the denial of trauma is even worse than the original trauma. So if anybody ever comes to you talking about trauma, just be incredibly patient and kind with them and make sure you don't deny it. So I know these are a general list, but you're going to have a very specific thing tied to it. So I'm going to tell you mine just so you can hear how it works. I didn't know this, but obviously I knew that my father died when I was 6 weeks old. It was a factor of my life. What I didn't know is just how invalid I actually felt from that experience. And not just from him dying, but him not being there. And just as an example, I would go to elementary school and this wasn't so conscious, it's more looking back on it. I would think all of these people have fathers. I actually wasn't totally right about that, but most of them did. Interestingly, my best friend in elementary school was somebody who had also lost their father, and I connected with him on that, although we didn't even know. We just became friends, but somewhere we knew. So mine was about validity, and it took me over 40 years to realize this, and I'm not saying it's going to take you that long. Now that I understand this concept and can pass it on, hopefully you'll get it better. So you hear I have the broad picture of validity. I didn't think I was as good as anybody in a certain way. And why? Because of the specific. The death of my father, my mother being depressed from it, my brother reeling from it, my extended family reeling from it, and all of the talk about mortality. These were all things that affected me and left a void. That's the specific thing that attaches to the general validity. Then I developed an action step. What am I going to do about it? And this took me the longest of all, I think, but it also is the thing that finally broke me through. I realized that I was searching for father figures to solve that void. And they were all proving to be incredibly unsatisfying. And it was very upsetting. And so I took that core narrative and decided I'm going to live a different life than this core narrative was that reflects what I was living. And I decided I'm going to reject all father figures moving forward. I won't search for a single one of them, not even for a single second. And I decided I can do better than they did as a father to my kids and also, in interacting with other people. And I will use my aggression to do so. These are all action steps I've talked about at various points, but this is how I developed my core narrative. I'm just going to review that again. There was the general, very broad and high stakes concept that in my case happened to be validity. The thing that it most connected to was the sense of not having a father and what it meant for my differences. And then there was an action of how I was going to address that. And I decided on that action myself, but you need to know those steps. Now, why is this so important, the core narrative? Well, here's why. Actually, I'm going to say a bunch of stuff. It's not limited to this, but these are some ideas about why the core narrative is so important. First of all, if we're looking for specific action steps that we're going to do in mind-body work, the core narrative is going to drive so many of our action steps that we develop. In the emotional column, all of those emotions fit in with the core narrative, and the core narrative essentially can become a guiding principle for how we're going to deal with that. We'll have to tinker with it to see how it fits with each specific theme, but it gives us a guidepost for that. It also reduces doubt quite a bit because you suddenly can believe in yourself at a level you couldn't before. And when it comes to power, it's built in to that cake because power is all about knowing your core narrative and choosing a powerful path. But it does drive so many of the action steps in all three columns. It also doesn't get distracted by other aspects of emotional life, so it's very clarifying. So when you're going through your emotional themes, you might find there's different aspects. Well, if you're not quite sure what's really bothering you, the chances are that it's something pretty closely tied to your core narrative. One other thing I like about it is it becomes like an emotional mantra. You can carry that with you everywhere you go. You don't have to remember much. It's one thing that I've developed into my system is some very, very simple ideas that can keep you to just a couple of things. And that will allow you to utilize it well. So it's almost like you get to remember all your emotional themes more easily because they're codified within the core narrative. And it becomes that mantra. I could walk around and be like, oh, okay, I'm always looking out for validity. Always. And I'm always looking for ways to show myself that I am valid now. It also works towards clarity and peace because it incorporates power. So I don't actually go around looking to be valid anymore. I just know I am. And it took me recognizing that I didn't feel that and how it had affected me and what I wanted to do about it. And then enacting what I wanted to do about it to get clarity and peace. I did not have peace about validity or father figures or any of it for over 4 decades. But when I realized through my back pain primarily, and then the subsequent things that followed, which was things like nobody understood it or the father figures that I wanted to validate it wouldn't. And I realized I have to do this for myself. So here's another thing that it does for us. The core narrative enhances our permission to be powerful and it reminds us to do it. And that's why it's so important to keep it front and center all the time. We need that permission. We have not had that permission in the past. The core narrative gives us permission to do it. Another wonderful thing about the core narrative is it turns trauma and aggression, it turns it into something that we can use. It turns it into fuel for moving forward. Now, again, a lot of times people don't like the term trauma, and it's okay if you don't. I'm not attached to that. What's important, though, is that your story the story of you becomes acceptable. It becomes something that is just a part of you, and you don't have to explain it or apologize for it. And you can use that and the aggression you'd have from it, because generally these stories are not particularly happy ones. You can use it as fuel to move into the future in a much more powerful way. It is the key to the power column for this reason. It is the fuel that you're going to use to become powerful. When it comes to doubt, it annihilates it in large measure. Now, obviously, you need to get your answers. We talked about in a video I released last week about how to articulate doubts and how to get to it. But one thing it particularly annihilates is doubt about you or your profile being insurmountable. So that's that third level of doubt. The core narrative particularly helps with that. The core narrative also can open the door to your sense of purpose. So when you know who you are, and you know how you've been hurt, and you know how you've been not thinking good thoughts about yourself, suddenly it opens the door to a new way of living, where you get to be more aligned with your core narrative self, not those false narratives that were negative, but the positive one that validates you, that loves you, and wants to do better. You're going to be able to find your purpose in that state in a much better way. So I use the core narrative as a kind of battering ram against trauma. I keep that mantra in my head. I say, trauma's not going to rule my life. The core narrative is. I'm deciding now. You can also use it to protect you from the aggression or nonsense of other people. People are, and I don't mean it like everybody's negative or bad, but there's a lot of aggression in society, especially unconsciously, and people will try to get you mixed up about who you are. Well, when you know your core narrative, no one can mix you up ever again. And if you need help developing the core narrative further, I'm happy to do it. You can put it in the comments. We can talk about it. You can email me at dan@crushingdoubt.org. Anything you want to do to get that developed, I'm happy to help. It's a very powerful tool. You can use this to keep you focused and clear and purposeful. It's the thing that can allow you to be fiercely in your own corner. Think about it. How are you supposed to know how to be in your own corner if you don't even know where you stand? The core narrative tells you where you stand. Now, it's also something that you're going to find yourself asking, is this really true? The core narrative should be so clear that you'll know that it is. And there is a power in choosing that reality. So, the core narrative is an incredibly powerful thing. And it's not that hard to develop. It's kind of mystifying to me that in therapy, it often doesn't get done that way. I think we're too busy looking at the nuances of things and the shades of gray and all the different parts of us and seeing that bigger, complicated picture. But the core narrative allows us to simplify in a way that's completely accurate. So I look forward to talking to you more about the core narrative and how to develop it. But if you haven't already, click below and I will get back to you personally. Thank you so much for watching and listening.